Welcome back, everyone. In this lecture, we're going to talk about how a Flask website works. What we're going to do is go over in general how Flask websites operate, specifically the types of sites that we're going to be building in this course. And what I want to show you is a connection to each major idea in a Flask web application to a section or topic in this course. So as we go along with the actual functions of a main Flask web application, I'm going to connect it to certain libraries that we'll be discussing throughout the course. The main idea here is as you go along through the course, if you arrive at a section, you already understand the context of why you're learning about that particular topic to create a Flask web application. So let's get started. Let's imagine you're going to visit a website, and this website happens to be written in Flask. You're at your computer, you open up your browser, and then the first thing you're going to see is the front end of the website rendered in the browser. Now there's a few fundamental front-end technologies, and those are HTML, which is actually going to display the page elements. So for example, that could be something like the actual text on the website. Then CSS will style the elements, so maybe change the font of that text or color the text. Then the site may also use Bootstrap, which is going to provide automatic styling and components through the use of CSS and some JavaScript and jQuery calls. So again, HTML, that's actually displaying those page elements, CSS for styling, and then Bootstrap to provide some automatic styling. And we have a crash course in these three main topics, HTML, CSS, and Bootstrap. For the kind of actual websites we're creating here, we don't really need to dive in that deeply into JavaScript or jQuery. Instead, we're going to do that in conjunction with Bootstrap. So we're going to have crash courses in these front-end technologies. So after that, you're going to want to add some sort of level of interactivity. Technically, right now, you're just going to have a static site if you only have the front-end technologies. Now, interactivity, what do I mean by that? Well, every major website performs some sort of variation of these main operations. Most websites are going to be able to, 1, accept information from a user, 2, retrieve information from a database, 3, create, update, or delete information in that database, and then 4, display information back to the user that's relevant to them based off of step 1, what they requested or what information they provided. Now, in order to perform that sort of level of interactivity, being able to connect a request from the front-end user to some sort of database, we're going to need a web framework. So the idea of a web framework, just in general, is to accept user information from the website, use it, maybe connect it to a back-end database, and then report back something relevant that could be stored in the database back to the front end so the user can see it. So Flask is our web framework of choice, and that's going to allow us to use and connect Python code to the web. And Flask is a great choice for a web framework because it's super simple to use. If you have a very simple website, it just takes a few lines of code to get your website up and running with Flask. And then because of this simplicity, Flask sometimes has a reputation for being too simple or not scalable, but that's actually not true. There's tons of third-party libraries for Flask that allow you to easily add some way more advanced functionality of Flask and be able to scale Flask. So often people ask, when should I use Flask or when should I use Django? And really at a certain point, it's going to be up to a personal choice because there's more than enough third-party libraries that are open source that can make Flask do everything that Django can. So just keep that in mind, and we'll talk about the differences between Flask and Django later on in more detail. But we have Flask as our choice for web frameworks because it's so simple to use and it's really awesome for beginners. So we'll be using Flask and Python to connect HTML templates and then retrieve, edit, or return information. So let's talk about that first step that most major websites do, and that's accepting user information. This can be as simple as just collecting a form of information for a survey, or accepting something like an email or password combination, or maybe your query into Google search. Those are all the instance of a user filling out an information inside of a form, and then the website retrieves that information. So in our case, in order to create these forms, we're going to use a library called WT Forms that works really well with Flask. In the crash course, we first learn about HTML forms, and then later on in the course, we'll know how to actually create those automatically with Flask. So we're going to learn 2 ways of doing these forms. The next step is to actually communicate with a database and retrieve information. So in our case, we're going to be using SQLite as our database of choice. It's a very popular database. It already comes with Python, meaning there's no additional install, so you don't have to have any headaches over getting up a database ready and working. And again, despite its name and reputation, SQLite can actually scale to quite a large website. And if you're in this course and you're just learning about Flask and Python, then it's highly probable that it's going to serve all your needs. So it should work fine for us. And in addition to this, we're going to learn about libraries such as SQL Alchemy, which allows us to write Python code instead of direct SQL statements. And we'll also learn about Flask Migrate, which allows us to automatically update any changes to our database, again, all through Python. Now, a big part of working with a database is called CRUD, and that stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. So with any database, we're going to want the ability to create a new row, read a row that already exists, update a row that already exists, or delete a row or information entirely from our database if necessary. And already here, we can get this idea that Flask is serving as sort of a middleman between the front end and what the user sees and the back end and the information that's stored. So once we actually connect these two, in some sort of capacity, we're probably going to want to return or display information back to the user. So in order to do that, we're going to use something called Jinja templates, which actually grab information from Python and Flask and send that information back as HTML. So that's the actual method, syntax-wise, that we're going to be using as the glue between Flask and the front end. So this is a super high level overview. There's lots more possibilities that we're going to talk about in this course that we haven't discussed here. Things like accepting payments, REST APIs, user authentication and login, and so much more. But this is the level I want you to be aware of. That way when you start learning about these different sections, such as the forms or template sections or database sections of Flask, you already understand the context that we're talking about as far as how Flask websites work. Okay, so as a very quick overview, the front end that's rendered in the browser, that's going to be your HTML, CSS, and Bootstrap. Those are the three main crash courses for the front end that we cover. There's also things like JavaScript and jQuery, and there's a lot of other JavaScript libraries that also work in the front end. But for our use cases, we're not going to need any of that. We're still going to be able to create lots of really awesome websites without those more advanced JavaScript functionality. And a lot of that functionality that we need is already integrated into Bootstrap 4. And then Python is going to be the coding language that allows us to use the Flask web framework. Flask is going to render HTML templates, then we can edit them with Jinja and can communicate with a database through the use of libraries such as SQL Alchemy. And in particular, we're going to be using Flask SQL Alchemy, which is specialized for Flask web framework. Now, don't worry about memorizing all these terms. This is just a high-level overview to put the course topics in context. And we're going to be building up very slowly, starting from the front end and working our all the way back, and then creating larger applications, such as a social network project. Then once we understand how to connect the front end to the back end fully with Flask, we'll slowly introduce other topics, such as user registration, authentication, REST APIs, payment systems, and more. So don't worry again about memorizing all of this. This is just a general high-level overview. If you have any questions, feel free to post them to the Q&A forums and we can answer them. But keep in mind, a lot of your questions are probably going to be answered as you go through the course. So maybe just jot them down or keep them in the back of your mind, because as we learn and dive into a lot more detail about each of these topics, we're going to clarify things a lot more. But first, before all of this, we got to get a handle on the basics. So in case you need them, let's get started with the crash course on the front-end technologies like HTML, CSS, and Bootstrap. I'm super excited to finally start typing and get into code. Let's get started.